I arrived at my sister's backyard pool party wearing a simple one-piece swimsuit and carrying a faded beach towel, expecting nothing more than an afternoon of family time and maybe a few laps to work out the stiffness in my shoulder. What I didn't expect was to be treated like a safety hazard by some 20-something lifeguard who took one look at my graying hair and decided I belonged in the shallow end with the toddlers. But when that same lifeguard saw my old ID fall out of my beach bag, when he read the name printed there in bold military font, everything changed. Suddenly, it wasn't just about pool rules anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun blazed mercilessly over Riverside, California that Saturday afternoon, turning the concrete around my sister Monica's pool into a griddle that could cook an egg. I'd driven the 43 miles from my small apartment in Moreno Valley, past strip malls and housing developments that all looked identical, past the familiar landmarks that marked the distance between my quiet retirement and the chaos of family gatherings. The radio had been silent during the drive, just the way I preferred it these days. Too much noise made my thoughts wander to places I'd rather not revisit. Monica's house sat in one of those newer developments where every lawn looked magazine perfect and every mailbox matched the homeowner association guidelines. White stucco, red tile roof, 3-car garage, and a backyard that had been designed more for Instagram photos than actual living. The pool dominated the space, kidney-shaped with a hot tub attachment and one of those infinity edges that made the water appear to spill directly into the San Bernardino Mountains beyond. It was the kind of pool that screamed money and status, which made sense since Monica's husband, Derek, worked in pharmaceutical sales and pulled down more in a month than I had ever seen in 6. I parked my 12-year-old Honda Civic between Derek's Tesla and Monica's Range Rover, feeling like I was placing a paperclip between two pieces of jewelry. The contrast didn't bother me anymore, hadn't for years. I'd learned long ago that the things that really mattered couldn't be purchased at a dealership or measured by square footage. The sounds hit me before I even reached the backyard gate. Splashing, laughter, music pumping from hidden speakers, the sizzle of something expensive cooking on what was probably a built-in grill that cost more than most people's cars. Children's voices mixed with adult conversation, creating that particular symphony of family gatherings that could either warm your heart or give you a headache, depending on your tolerance for controlled chaos. I pushed through the gate carrying my simple canvas beach bag and wearing flip-flops that had seen better decades. My swimsuit was a practical navy blue one-piece, the kind designed for actual swimming rather than lounging with a cocktail. Over it, I wore a loose cotton cover-up that hid the network of scars across my left shoulder and upper arm, remnants from a time when my biggest worry wasn't whether I'd remembered to bring sunscreen. The party was in full swing. Derek commanded the grill with the enthusiasm of someone who'd watched too many cooking shows, wielding tongs like a conductor's baton while explaining the proper temperature for Chilean sea bass to anyone within earshot. Monica floated on an oversized inflatable unicorn, wearing designer sunglasses and a bikini that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, directing traffic and social dynamics with the subtle authority of someone who'd hosted 1,000 gatherings just like this one. Their friends clustered in small groups around the pool deck, the women in cover-ups that revealed more than they concealed, and the men in board shorts that advertised their gym memberships. Everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, all perfectly tanned and strategically casual in that way that required significant time and money to achieve. The pool itself buzzed with activity. Children cannonballed off the diving board while their parents pretended not to worry about lawsuits. Teenagers clustered in the shallow end, more interested in their phones than actual swimming. A few adults did leisurely laps in the designated swimming lane, their strokes careful and measured to avoid splashing anyone who might be holding a drink. What caught my attention was the lifeguard. He sat elevated on one of those tall chairs that made him visible to everyone in the pool area, whistle around his neck, zinc oxide on his nose, radiating that particular kind of authority that came from being 24 years old and completely convinced that his summer job made him the guardian of public safety. His name tag read Tyler in bold letters, and he surveyed the pool with the intensity of someone monitoring a nuclear reactor rather than a backyard gathering. I'd been to enough of Monica's parties to know the routine. She'd hug me with enthusiasm that felt a little performative, ask me how I was doing with the kind of concern that expected a brief, cheerful answer, then introduce me to people as my sister Kate. She's retired military. Like that explained everything anyone needed to know about me. It was shorthand for complicated, shorthand for different, shorthand for someone whose life experiences didn't quite fit into the neat categories that made for comfortable small talk. Monica spotted me before I had made it halfway across the deck. She slid off her unicorn float with practiced grace, water beading off her perfectly maintained tan, and approached with arms spread wide for the obligatory greeting ritual. "Kate, you made it!" Her hug was warm but brief, the kind that conveyed affection without actually committing to intimacy. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind. You know how you are about crowds." That stung a little, even though it was true. I had become someone who preferred quiet spaces and controlled environments, someone who needed escape routes and exit strategies even at family gatherings. But when hearing it said out loud in front of her friends who were probably already cataloging my appearance and trying to figure out where I fit in their social ecosystem, felt like being defined by my limitations rather than my choices. Traffic was heavy, which was partly true and completely non-committal. "The pool looks great, very impressive." Monica beamed with the pride of someone who'd spent significant money creating something beautiful. Derek designed the whole layout himself. The infinity edge was his idea. We can see all the way to Big Bear on clear days. She gestured toward the mountains with the enthusiasm of a real estate agent closing a deal. She led me toward a cluster of lounge chairs that had been positioned for optimal sun exposure and social observation. The chairs themselves were probably worth more than my car. All smooth curves and weather-resistant fabric and colors that coordinated perfectly with the outdoor decor. Monica's friends looked up from their conversation with polite interest, the kind of attention reserved for new arrivals who might provide fresh material for discussion. "Everyone, this is my sister Kate," Monica announced, her voice carrying that particular note of introduction that meant I was about to become a temporary object of curiosity. "She's just retired from the military, 26 years of service." The way she said it made it sound like an exotic hobby rather than a career that had defined most of my adult life. The introductions flowed past me in a blur of names I wouldn't remember, and professions that seemed to revolve around real estate, finance, and various forms of consulting. Everyone was friendly in that California way that maintained distance while appearing welcoming, offering me drinks and compliments on my tan while their eyes cataloged my scars and tried to calculate my age. I found myself gravitating toward the pool, partly because the heat was becoming unbearable and partly because I needed some distance from the social performance happening on the deck. The water looked perfect, crystal clear and inviting, with lane markers indicating serious swimmers were welcome alongside the casual splashers. Swimming had always been my escape, my meditation, my way of processing thoughts that were too complicated for words. In the water, my scars didn't matter, my age became irrelevant, and the steady rhythm of strokes and breathing created a kind of moving meditation that could quiet even the most persistent memories. I'd been swimming laps since I was 7 years old, had used pool time to decompress after difficult missions, and had found solace in the water when everything else felt chaotic and uncertain. I dropped my beach bag on an empty chair, slipped off my cover-up, and walked toward the deep end where the serious swimmers had established their territory. The diving board area was temporarily clear, the lap lanes open, the water calling to me with the promise of familiar comfort. That's when Tyler's whistle cut through the afternoon air like a referee stopping a soccer match. "Ma'am!" His voice carried across the pool with the authority of someone who'd never been questioned, never been challenged, never had to back up his decisions with anything more substantial than a laminated rule book. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay in the shallow end today." The entire pool area seemed to pause. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, became quieter, more focused. Children continued playing, but the adults turned their attention toward the developing situation with the kind of interest that suggested they were witnessing something potentially entertaining. I turned to face Tyler, who was leaning forward in his chair with the posture of someone delivering an important safety announcement. His expression was serious, professional, completely confident in his authority to manage pool access based on his assessment of individual capabilities. "I'm sorry?" I said, genuinely confused. I'd been swimming in deep water since before this kid was born, had logged more pool hours than most people accumulated in a lifetime, had once completed a 2-mile ocean swim in conditions that would have terrified professional athletes. The idea that I needed to be restricted to the shallow end felt surreal. "Pool safety policy," Tyler announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, playing to his audience of parents who nodded approvingly at his diligence. "Swimmers over a certain age need to demonstrate water competency before accessing the deep end. Insurance requirements." He said this with the confidence of someone quoting established law rather than making up rules as he went along. Monica appeared at my side, her expression caught between embarrassment and the desire to maintain social harmony. "Tyler, this is my sister. She's an excellent swimmer. Really, she's been swimming her whole life." Tyler's expression remained unmoved, the look of someone who'd heard every excuse and wasn't about to compromise his professional standards for family politics. "I appreciate that, but I can't make exceptions. Safety is everyone's responsibility." He gestured toward a section of the pool where elderly relatives and small children played in waist-deep water. "There's plenty of space to enjoy the pool without unnecessary risk." The words hit me like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were so casually dismissive. Unnecessary risk. Like my presence in the deep end represented a liability that needed to be managed, a problem that needed to be contained. Like my age and appearance automatically disqualified me from activities I'd been pursuing longer than Tyler had been alive. Around the pool, I could feel eyes watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Some of Monica's friends whispered among themselves, probably discussing whether Tyler was being appropriately cautious or unnecessarily harsh. A few of the men nodded approvingly, as if Tyler was demonstrating exactly the kind of firm authority they respected in young people. Derek approached from the grill, spatula still in hand, clearly hoping to diffuse the situation before it affected his carefully orchestrated party atmosphere. "Hey Tyler, maybe we could just let Kate take a quick swim. She's family, and I can vouch for her abilities." But Tyler was committed now, his authority publicly challenged, his professional judgment questioned in front of the people he was hired to protect. "I understand she's family, sir, but rules apply to everyone equally. I've seen too many accidents happen when people overestimate their capabilities." He looked directly at me, his expression mixing condescension with what he probably thought was kindness. "The shallow end has everything you need for a pleasant afternoon." Pleasant afternoon. Like I was some grandmother who needed to be managed and contained, someone whose ambitions needed to be adjusted to match her limitations. Like the network of scars on my shoulder meant weakness rather than survival. Like my graying hair indicated incompetence rather than experience. I stood there for a moment, feeling the heat of the concrete through my flip-flops, aware of every eye focused on me, processing the choice between making a scene and accepting the humiliation. This was Monica's party, her friends, her carefully constructed social environment. Challenging Tyler would create drama, force people to take sides, turn what was supposed to be a relaxing afternoon into an uncomfortable confrontation. So I nodded once, picked up my beach bag, and walked toward the shallow end where toddlers splashed and elderly relatives sat on submerged benches, chatting about grandchildren and retirement plans. I found an empty section of pool wall, sat on the edge with my feet in the water, and tried to pretend that being relegated to the kiddie section didn't feel like another small defeat in a series of adjustments I'd been making since returning to civilian life. But as I sat there, watching Tyler resume his vigilant surveillance of the pool, I felt something shifting in my beach bag. The waterproof pouch where I kept my identification had come loose, probably when I'd set the bag down too quickly. I reached in to secure it, and that's when everything changed. The military ID fell out onto the concrete with a soft plastic click that somehow carried more weight than Tyler's whistle, more authority than his rule book, more consequence than his insurance requirements. It landed face up in a patch of sunlight, the gold lettering clear and unmistakable even from a distance. Colonel Catherine Wilson, United States Army, retired. Tyler's eyes found it before I could reach down to pick it up. His expression shifted, confusion replacing confidence, uncertainty replacing authority. He stared at the ID for a long moment, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Around the pool, the afternoon continued. Children played, adults chatted, Derek flipped expensive fish on his expensive grill. But something had changed. Some invisible balance had shifted, and Tyler was no longer just a summer lifeguard managing pool safety for a backyard party. He was a young man who just realized he might have made a very significant mistake. Tyler climbed down from his lifeguard chair with movements that had lost their earlier confidence. He approached me with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, his earlier swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. The whistle around his neck bounced slightly with each step, and I noticed his hands were no longer steady as they had been when he was so certain about pool safety protocols. I bent down to retrieve my ID, but Tyler's voice stopped me halfway there. "Ma'am,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story."
He paused, swallowed hard, then tried again. "Is that real?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us had expected when this afternoon began. Around the pool, the party continued its lazy rhythm, but I could sense the shift in attention. Monica's friends were no longer pretending not to watch. Derek had stopped explaining proper grilling techniques to his captive audience. Even the teenagers had looked up from their phones, sensing drama in the adult world that might actually be worth their attention. I straightened slowly, holding the ID in my palm like it was something fragile, rather than a piece of laminated plastic that had survived more rough handling than Tyler could imagine. The gold lettering caught the afternoon sun, reflecting light that seemed to illuminate more than just the text. Colonel. 26 years of service distilled down to a single word that carried weight this young man was only beginning to understand. "It's real," I said quietly, my voice carrying none of the authority that rank usually commanded, none of the edge that might have made this moment about power rather than simple truth. Though I haven't used the title in civilian settings for 3 years now. Tyler's face went through a series of expressions like someone flipping through television channels, searching for something that made sense. Confusion, recognition, dawning realization, and finally something that looked like panic. He glanced back at his lifeguard chair as if it might provide guidance for a situation that definitely wasn't covered in the employee handbook. "I didn't know," he said. And for the first time since I'd arrived, his voice had lost that irritating certainty that had made him so dismissive earlier. "Your sister just said retired military. She didn't say—" He gestured weakly at the ID, unable to finish the sentence. Monica appeared beside us, like she'd materialized from thin air, her expression cycling between curiosity and concern. She'd heard enough of the conversation to know something significant was happening, but not enough to understand what it meant. "What's going on? Kate, what's that in your hand?" I handed her the ID without ceremony, watching her face change as she read the information that had somehow never come up in 3 years of family gatherings. Her eyebrows rose progressively higher as she processed each line, her mouth forming a small circle of surprise that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Colonel?" she said, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Kate, you never told me you were a colonel. I thought you were you said you were in the army, but you never said you were a colonel." "Just." The word carried more weight than she'd intended, summarizing years of assumptions about my service, my role, my significance in the larger machinery of military operations. Just retired military, like I'd spent 26 years filing paperwork or managing supply closets rather than leading soldiers through some of the most challenging operations the Army had ever undertaken. Derek had abandoned his grill entirely now, approaching with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for approaching wild animals or unstable explosives. His spatula hung forgotten in his hand as he read over Monica's shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching awe. "Holy shit," he whispered, then immediately looked embarrassed for swearing. "Sorry, Colonel Wilson? As in Colonel Catherine Wilson?" He paused, searching my face like he was trying to match it to a photograph he'd seen somewhere. "Didn't you command that operation in Syria? The one that saved those civilians trapped in the hospital?" The question hit me like cold water, sudden and shocking. It had been years since anyone had recognized my name in connection with Operation Sanctuary Light, longer still since someone had brought it up in casual conversation. That mission lived in classified files and military journals, in the memories of soldiers who'd been there, and the nightmares of commanders who had to make impossible decisions under impossible circumstances. "That was classified," I said automatically, the response so ingrained it came out before I could consider whether it was necessary anymore. Some habits die hard, especially ones that had kept people alive for decades. But Derek was nodding now, pieces clicking together in his mind like a puzzle solving itself. "It's not classified anymore. They declassified it last year. There was a whole documentary about modern military operations, and they featured your unit. They interviewed some of the soldiers who were there." He looked at me with new eyes, seeing past the graying hair and modest swimsuit to something he hadn't noticed before. "You led 300 soldiers through enemy territory to evacuate a civilian hospital under siege, saved over 800 people." Tyler had gone very still beside us, his face pale despite the California sun. I could practically see him replaying our earlier interaction, reassessing every word he'd spoken, every assumption he'd made about my capabilities based on my appearance. The confident young lifeguard who'd been so certain about pool safety was dissolving before our eyes, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Monica stared at the ID in her hands like it might transform into something else if she looked at it long enough. "Kate, you never told me you were a colonel. I thought you were you said you were in the Army, but you never said you were a colonel."
It says you were awarded the Purple Heart twice. The scars on my shoulder suddenly felt more visible, though they were still hidden beneath my cover-up. Those medals lived in a box in my bedroom closet, gathering dust alongside commendations and certificates that documented a career most people would never understand. I didn't display them, didn't talk about them, didn't define myself by them, because they represented moments I'd rather not revisit in casual conversation. "Medals document events," I said carefully. "They don't necessarily define the person who received them." But Tyler was shaking his head, his expression transforming from embarrassment to something approaching reverence. "Ma'am, with respect, they absolutely do define the person who received them. They define someone who put their life on the line for others, someone who demonstrated courage under fire, someone who earned the highest honors this country can bestow." He was speaking louder now, loud enough that his words carried across the pool area to the other guests who had been pretending not to listen. I could see faces turning toward us, conversations stopping as people processed what they were hearing. The casual afternoon gathering was becoming something else, something more significant than anyone had anticipated. "Colonel Wilson," Tyler continued, his voice carrying the kind of respect that had been completely absent 30 minutes earlier, "I owe you an apology that goes way beyond pool safety. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your age and appearance, and I was completely wrong. Not just wrong about your swimming ability, but wrong about who you are as a person." The formal tone felt strange in the backyard setting, surrounded by pool toys and the smell of grilling fish. But there was sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before, a recognition that this moment had become about more than pool access or safety protocols. "Apology accepted," I said, "because it was true and because holding grudges was exhausting, and because this young man was learning a lesson that would serve him well for the rest of his life. But Tyler, I want you to remember something. Every person you meet has a story you don't know, experiences you can't see, capabilities that might not be obvious from their appearance. The next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone's limitations, maybe ask questions instead. He nodded so vigorously I was worried he might injure his neck. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. I will never make this mistake again. Around us, the party was slowly resuming its normal rhythm, but with an undercurrent of awareness that hadn't been there before. People were looking at me differently now, not with the polite curiosity reserved for Monica's military sister, but with something approaching respect. It was uncomfortable and gratifying at the same time, recognition I'd never asked for but perhaps had earned through decades of service that most of these people would never fully understand. Derek had returned to his grill, but kept glancing over like he was seeing me for the first time. Monica sat down beside me on the pool edge, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested this conversation was far from over. "Kate," she said quietly, "I'm sorry we never made more effort to understand what your service really meant. I think we were so focused on not prying that we missed the fact that we were essentially ignoring a huge part of who you are." That observation hit closer to home than I was comfortable with. It was possible that my own reluctance to discuss my military career had contributed to my family's ignorance about it. I'd been so concerned about not being defined solely by my rank and service that I'd perhaps made them invisible, treated them like shameful secrets rather than experiences that had shaped me into the person I'd become. "Military service changes you," I said, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes in ways that are difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It's not that I didn't want to share it with you, it's that I wasn't sure how to translate those experiences into language that would make sense in civilian settings. Tyler was still standing nearby, clearly uncertain whether he should return to his lifeguard duties or continue participating in this unexpected family therapy session. His phone remained in his hand, and I suspect he was still processing whatever information he'd found about my military service record. "Colonel Wilson," he said hesitantly, "would it be appropriate if I asked you about your military experience? I mean, I understand if it's too personal or classified or traumatic to discuss, but I'd like to learn more if you're comfortable sharing." The request was respectful, genuine, coming from someone who seemed to understand that he was asking for a privilege rather than demanding information he was entitled to. It was so different from his earlier attitude that it felt like we were having this conversation with a completely different person. "Some things I can discuss," I said carefully. "Some things remain classified. Some things are just too personal to share with people I've just met, but I appreciate the respectful way you're asking." That seemed to satisfy him, and he nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested he was beginning to grasp the complexity of military service, the layers of experience that couldn't be easily summarized or explained to civilian audiences. Monica was still sitting beside me, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested this conversation was far from over. "Kate," she said, "would you be willing to tell us more about your service? I mean, not the classified stuff or anything traumatic, but just who you were in the military, what your role was like." The question was fair, and the setting was surprisingly appropriate. These were people who cared about me, who were making an effort to understand a part of my life they'd never explored. Perhaps it was time to bridge that gap, to find a way to share experiences that had shaped me without overwhelming people with details they weren't equipped to process. "I was a combat leader," I said simply. "I spent most of my career in special operations, leading soldiers in challenging environments, making decisions that affected their safety and the success of our missions. It was demanding work that required constant learning, adaptation, and growth." Tyler leaned forward slightly, his expression intent. "What was the most challenging part?" That was a complicated question with answers that ranged from tactical difficulties to emotional burdens to the simple exhaustion of being responsible for other people's lives 24 hours a day. But there was one aspect that civilian audiences could usually understand. The responsibility, I said finally. When you're in command, every decision you make affects other people.
Their safety, their success, their ability to come home to their families. That weight never leaves you, even after you retire. Derek had abandoned his grill again and was listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for emergency announcements. "Is that why you're so, I don't know, calm? You always seem like nothing rattles you." That observation surprised me, mainly because I didn't feel particularly calm most of the time. Civilian life was full of minor crises that seemed disproportionate to their actual significance, social dynamics that felt unnecessarily complicated, problems that had obvious solutions if people would just communicate directly instead of dancing around issues. Military training teaches you to assess situations accurately, I said, to distinguish between actual emergencies and perceived crises. Most civilian problems aren't actually life-threatening, so they don't require the same level of stress response. Tyler was nodding like I was revealing the secrets of the universe. That makes sense. So when I was making such a big deal about pool safety, you knew it wasn't actually an emergency situation. I knew it was a misunderstanding that could be resolved with communication, I said diplomatically. Though I have to admit, being restricted to the shallow end felt more insulting than I expected it to. He winced at that, understanding that his well-intentioned safety measures had felt like a judgment about my capabilities, my worth, my place in the social hierarchy of pool access. It was a reminder that good intentions didn't always translate to positive outcomes, that authority needed to be exercised with wisdom as well as confidence. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift toward evening, casting longer shadows across the pool deck and creating the kind of golden light that made everything look more significant than it might otherwise. The party was winding down naturally, families with small children beginning to pack up their belongings, adults moving toward the indoor spaces where air conditioning provided relief from the heat. But something had changed in the atmosphere, some fundamental shift in how people were interacting with me and with each other. Conversations felt more substantial, connections more genuine, like the revelation of my military background had somehow given people permission to move beyond surface-level pleasantries. Monica's friend Sarah approached with her young daughter in tow, the little girl clutching a pool noodle and dripping chlorinated water onto the deck. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "I overheard some of your conversation, and I wanted to thank you for your service. My husband is deployed right now, and it means a lot to meet someone who understands what military families go through." The thanks felt genuine, coming from someone who lived with the daily reality of military life, rather than someone offering empty platitudes at a checkout counter. I shook her hand, noting the slight tremor that suggested the stress of deployment, the particular exhaustion that came from managing everything alone while worrying about someone thousands of miles away. "What branch?" I asked. "Marines. He's on his second deployment to Jordan. 6 more months." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Isabella here keeps asking when Daddy's coming home, and I keep saying soon, even though 6 months feels like forever when you're 4 years old." Isabella looked up at me with the solemn expression of a child who understood that something important was happening even if she couldn't articulate what it was. Military children learned early to read adult emotions, to understand that some conversations are more significant than they appeared. "Your daddy is doing important work," I told her, crouching down to her level, "and your mommy is doing important work too, taking care of you while he's away." Isabella nodded seriously, then whispered, "Are you a soldier too?" "I used to be," I said. "Now I'm retired,
which means I finished my job and get to spend time doing other things, like swimming in pools and talking to smart little girls like you." She giggled at that, and some of the tension left Sarah's face. Military spouses carried burdens that civilian families couldn't fully understand, and sometimes the simple acknowledgement from someone who'd been there meant more than elaborate support systems or well-meaning advice. Tyler had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a world he'd never experienced. When Sarah and Isabella moved away, he turned to me with an expression that was part curiosity, part admiration. "Colonel Wilson, can I ask you something personal?" "I can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask." "Do you miss it? The military, I mean. Do you miss the responsibility and the challenge and the sense of purpose?" That was a more complicated question than he probably realized, touching on aspects of retirement that most veterans struggled with regardless of their rank or length of service. The transition from military to civilian life was difficult for everyone, but it carried particular challenges for senior officers who'd spent decades in positions of significant responsibility. "I miss parts of it," I said carefully. "I miss working with people who shared a common mission, who understood that individual success meant less than collective achievement. I miss the clarity of purpose, the sense that what we were doing mattered in ways that extended beyond immediate personal benefit." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "That must make civilian life feel kind of empty, or at least less meaningful?" "Different," I corrected. "Not necessarily less meaningful, but different. The challenge is finding ways to contribute that feel significant without requiring the same level of responsibility or risk." Derek had apparently been listening as well, because he approached with an expression that suggested he was processing new information about someone he'd known for years but never really understood.
"Kate, I have to ask this, and forgive me if it's inappropriate, but why didn't you stay in the military? I mean, if you were a colonel, couldn't you have kept advancing? Become a general or something?" The question was reasonable from someone who understood civilian careers where advancement was usually limited only by competence and opportunity. Military careers were more complicated, governed by promotion timelines, available positions, and political considerations that had nothing to do with individual merit. "Military careers have natural endpoints," I said. 26 years is a long time to serve, and the demands of senior leadership positions are significant. At some point, it's time to let younger officers take on those responsibilities while you transition to the next phase of your life." It was a diplomatic answer that avoided the more complicated truth about military politics, about the challenges facing women in senior leadership positions, about the personal costs of spending decades in a profession that demanded everything while offering limited flexibility for personal relationships or alternative life paths. Tyler was still processing this information, clearly struggling to reconcile the professional credentials he'd discovered with the woman sitting beside a suburban pool in a modest swimsuit. It was probably the first time he'd encountered someone with significant military experience outside of movies or television, where military personnel were either portrayed as larger-than-life heroes or damaged veterans struggling with civilian reintegration. "Colonel Wilson," he said finally, "I hope this isn't out of line, but would you be willing to give me some advice? I'm 24, I'm finishing college, and I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. Meeting you has made me think about military service in ways I never considered before." The request surprised me, mainly because most young people his age seem to view military service as either a last resort for people without better options or a dangerous adventure they'd rather avoid entirely. His genuine interest suggested a level of maturity that hadn't been evident during our earlier encounter. "What do you want to know?" I asked. "Everything," he said immediately, then caught himself. "I mean, whatever you're comfortable sharing. What it's really like, what the training is like, What kind of person succeeds in the military? Whether it's worth the sacrifices you have to make? Those were big questions that deserved thoughtful answers, the kind of conversation that required more time and privacy than a poolside setting could provide. But I could see the sincerity in his expression, the genuine desire to understand something that most of his generation viewed with suspicion or indifference. Military service isn't for everyone, I said carefully. It requires significant personal sacrifice, physical and mental challenges, and a willingness to subordinate individual preferences to collective needs. But for people who thrive in structured environments, who want to contribute to something larger than themselves, who can handle responsibility and stress, it can be incredibly rewarding. Tyler was nodding along, but I could see questions forming behind his eyes, probably wondering whether he possessed the qualities I was describing, whether he could handle the challenges I was outlining in such general terms. The most important thing is understanding that military service changes you, not necessarily in bad ways, but in permanent ways. You'll see things, experience things, learn things about yourself and the world that you can't unknow. For some people, that growth is exactly what they need. For others, it's more challenging than they anticipated. Derek was listening to this conversation with the fascination of someone discovering that his sister-in-law was far more complex and interesting than he had ever realized. Monica sat quietly beside me, occasionally glancing over with an expression that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about our relationship. The sun was definitely moving toward evening now, painting the pool deck in shades of gold and amber that made even the most ordinary conversations feel somehow significant. The party was winding down around us, but the small group gathered near the pool edge seemed reluctant to break up this unexpected opportunity to glimpse a world most of them had never considered. Tyler pulled out his phone again, but this time with purpose rather than panic. "Colonel Wilson, would it be appropriate if I got your contact information? I'd really like to continue this conversation when we have more time, maybe ask you more specific questions about military service." The request was reasonable, coming from someone who seemed genuinely interested in learning rather than someone looking for entertainment or validation. I'd mentored younger soldiers throughout my career, and while Tyler wasn't a soldier, he was a young person trying to make intelligent decisions about his future based on accurate information rather than assumptions. "I think that would be fine," I said, accepting his phone and entering my information with the careful precision that had become second nature after decades of handling sensitive communications. "But Tyler, if you're seriously considering military service, you should also talk to recruiters, visit bases, and speak with current service members from different branches and specialties. Get multiple perspectives." He nodded earnestly, probably already making mental notes about research strategies and information gathering techniques. The transformation from arrogant lifeguard to thoughtful young adult had been remarkable to witness. A reminder that people were capable of growth when presented with new information and appropriate challenges. Monica touched my arm gently, drawing my attention back to the immediate family dynamics that had been evolving throughout this unexpected afternoon. "Kate, I think we owe you more than just an apology for not understanding your background. We owe you recognition for everything you accomplished and appreciation for everything you sacrificed while serving." The words were kind, but they carried implications that made me slightly uncomfortable. Recognition and appreciation were nice, but they weren't what I'd been seeking when I decided to attend this pool party. I just wanted to swim some laps and enjoy time with family without having to explain or defend or educate anyone about military service. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I hope this doesn't change how you see me as a person. I'm still the same sister who shows up to your parties, brings practical gifts instead of thoughtful ones, and prefers quiet conversations to large group activities. The military experience is part of who I am, but it's not the only part." Derek laughed at that, a sound that carried warmth and genuine affection. Trust me, Kate, nothing could make us think you're any less practical or any more social than we already knew you were. But knowing about your military background does help explain why you always seem so competent. Like you could handle any crisis that came up. That observation was probably more accurate than Derek realized. Military training did create a certain approach to problem solving, a tendency to assess situations quickly and develop action plans rather than becoming overwhelmed by uncertainty or complexity. It was a useful skill set in civilian life, though it sometimes made me impatient with people who seemed to create drama around relatively simple problems. The afternoon was definitely transitioning toward evening now, families beginning the ritual of gathering belongings and coaching overtired children toward cars and the promise of dinner at home. The pool area was slowly emptying, conversations becoming more intimate as the crowd thinned and social energy shifted from party mode to genuine connection. Tyler had returned to his lifeguard chair, but his posture was completely different now. Instead of surveying the pool area with officious authority, he sat quietly, occasionally glancing over at our small group with an expression that suggested he was still processing everything he'd learned.
The confident young man who'd been so certain about pool safety protocols had been replaced by someone who understood that the world was more complicated than employee handbooks could address. I found myself looking at the deep end of the pool, the area I'd been denied access to just a few hours earlier. The water looked exactly the same as it had when Tyler had restricted me to the shallow end, but everything else had changed. Context mattered. Perspective mattered. The assumptions people made about each other based on limited information could create barriers that had nothing to do with actual capabilities or limitations. Monica followed my gaze and seemed to read my thoughts. "You know," she said quietly, "you still haven't had your swim. Would you like to take some laps before we head inside?" The offer was simple, but it carried weight that went beyond recreational swimming. It was an acknowledgement of what had happened earlier, a recognition that access to the pool should never have been in question, a quiet correction of an injustice that had been resolved but not forgotten. I looked around at the group that had formed around me, these people who'd spent the afternoon learning things about military service and family dynamics and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance. Tyler watched from his chair with the respectful attention of someone who understood he was witnessing something significant. Derek and Monica sat nearby with expressions that suggested they were seeing their family relationships from a new perspective. "Yes," I said finally, standing up and slipping off my cover-up. "I think I'd like that very much." The scars on my shoulder were visible now, pale lines against skin that had been tanned by years of outdoor training and deployment to desert climates. They were part of my story, evidence of experiences I'd survived and challenges I'd overcome, not sources of shame or limitation, but reminders of resilience and recovery. I walked toward the deep end with the steady confidence of someone who belonged there, who would always belong there, who would never again accept limitations based on other people's assumptions about my capabilities. The water was perfect, crystal clear and inviting, promising the kind of meditative rhythm that had sustained me through decades of challenges, both military and civilian. Behind me, I could hear Tyler climbing down from his lifeguard chair one more time, but this time, his footsteps carried a different purpose entirely. Tyler's approach this time carried none of the officiousness that had marked our earlier encounter. His steps were measured, respectful, and when he reached the edge of the pool where I stood preparing to enter the water, he stopped at a distance that conveyed deference rather than authority. The whistle around his neck hung quietly, no longer a symbol of power, but simply part of a uniform that suddenly seemed too large for someone who had discovered his own limitations. "Colonel Wilson," he said, his voice carrying a formality that felt both appropriate and slightly awkward in the backyard setting. "Before you swim, I wanted to say something that goes beyond my earlier apology." I paused at the pool's edge, my feet already feeling the cool kiss of water that promised relief from both the physical heat and the emotional weight of the afternoon's revelations. Around us, the remaining party guests had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even the children in the shallow end had stopped their splashing, drawn by the adult attention focused on our small drama. "What you did in Syria," Tyler continued, his words careful and considered,
saving those civilians under enemy fire, leading your soldiers through impossible terrain while wounded yourself. That operation is studied in military academies now. They use it as an example of leadership under extreme pressure, of putting mission and people above personal safety. I felt my jaw tighten slightly, not from anger, but from the discomfort that always accompanied public recognition of events I preferred to keep private. Those memories lived in a carefully controlled space in my mind, acknowledged but not celebrated, honored but not glorified. They represented decisions made under circumstances I hoped never to face again, courage born from necessity rather than heroism. "Tyler," I said quietly, "that mission was successful because of the soldiers I led, not because of any individual heroics. Good leadership means enabling others to excel, not seeking personal recognition." But he was shaking his head, his expression carrying the earnestness of someone who had spent the last hour researching details that painted a picture far different from the modest woman standing before him. "Ma'am, with respect, the after-action reports are clear. When your convoy was ambushed and you took shrapnel in your shoulder, you continued commanding the evacuation for 6 hours while refusing medical treatment until every civilian was safely extracted." Derek had moved closer, drawn by the specificity of Tyler's account. Monica sat at the pool's edge with her feet in the water, listening with the rapt attention of someone discovering family history she'd never known existed. The golden afternoon light cast everything in warm tones that made even the most serious conversation feel somehow sacred. "The Purple Hearts weren't for minor injuries," Tyler pressed on, his research having clearly uncovered details that official summaries had sanitized. "The first was for the Syria operation, but the second was for Afghanistan, where you provided medical aid to wounded soldiers while your position was under direct fire for over 12 hours. You saved 11 lives that day while taking fire from 3 different directions." The specificity of his knowledge caught me off guard. Those details weren't in the standard databases accessible to civilians, which meant that Tyler had been remarkably thorough in his research, found sources that went beyond simple military records. The thought that a 24-year-old lifeguard had spent his afternoon investigating my service history with the dedication of a graduate student was both flattering and unsettling. "How did you find all this information?" I asked, genuinely curious about his sources. Tyler's cheeks flushed slightly, the first sign of embarrassment he'd shown since his initial recognition of my rank. "I have a friend who's a Marine recruiter. After I saw your ID, I called him in a panic, thinking maybe he could help me understand how badly I'd messed up. He made some calls, accessed some records, and..." He gestured helplessly with his hands. "Colonel Wilson, you're not just any retired officer. You're a legend. There are Marines and soldiers serving right now who've heard stories about you, who use your operations as case studies for leadership in combat." The word legend hit me like cold water, shocking and unwelcome. Legends are for people who had died gloriously or accomplished impossible things through supernatural means. I was simply a woman who had done my job under difficult circumstances, who had made decisions based on training and instinct, and the absolute refusal to let good people die when I had the power to prevent it. "Legends are stories that grow in the telling," I said firmly. "What happened in Syria and Afghanistan were military operations conducted by well-trained teams under challenging conditions. Success came from preparation, teamwork, and the courage of soldiers who trusted their leadership enough to follow orders that required them to risk their lives for others." Monica was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that mixed pride with wonder and perhaps a touch of sadness that we'd never had these conversations in all the years since my retirement. "Kate, why do you minimize what you did?
Why can't you just accept that you accomplished extraordinary things?" The question touched something raw and complicated, the intersection of military culture and personal psychology that made it difficult for many veterans to accept recognition for actions that had simply felt necessary at the time. In combat, you didn't act heroically, you acted appropriately. You didn't perform extraordinary feats, you did what the situation required. The heroism was often invented later, by people who needed to make sense of chaos, by creating narratives of individual courage. "Because the moment you start believing your own legend," I said carefully, "you stop focusing on the people you're responsible for and start focusing on your reputation. Good leaders know that success belongs to the team. Failure belongs to the commander, and everything else is just noise that can interfere with making good decisions. Tyler was nodding along with this explanation, but I could see in his expression that he was struggling to reconcile my modest self-assessment with the documented evidence of actions that most people would consider genuinely heroic. The cognitive dissonance was probably healthy for him, a reminder that real courage often looked different from movie portrayals of military heroism. "Colonel Wilson," he said finally, "I understand your perspective on leadership and teamwork, but I hope you also understand that what I did earlier, dismissing you based on assumptions about your age and capabilities, that was the opposite of good leadership. I made judgments without information, exercised authority without wisdom, and disrespected someone who had earned honor through decades of service." His words carried genuine remorse, the kind of regret that comes from recognizing not just a mistake in judgment, but a failure of character. This was no longer about pool safety or insurance liability. It was about fundamental questions of respect, dignity, and the assumptions people make about each other based on superficial observations. "Tyler," I said, stepping closer to the pool edge and feeling the water lap against my ankles, "the fact that you can recognize that mistake and articulate what you learned from it tells me more about your character than your initial error did. Good people make bad decisions when they operate from incomplete information. The measure of character is what you do when you discover you were wrong." Derek had been listening to this exchange with the fascination of someone watching a master class in leadership philosophy, occasionally glancing between Tyler and me like he was witnessing something that would be discussed long after the pool party ended. The grill behind him sat abandoned, expensive fish probably overcooked by now, but no one seemed concerned about dinner when this kind of real-world education was happening in their backyard. "What I learned," Tyler said slowly, "is that respect should be offered first and withdrawn only when it's not deserved, rather than withheld until someone proves they've earned it. I should have treated you with courtesy and dignity from the moment you approached the pool, regardless of what assumptions I was making about your swimming ability." The insight was more sophisticated than I'd expected from someone his age, suggesting that his afternoon research had included some serious reflection on leadership principles and human dignity. It was the kind of learning that couldn't be taught in employee handbooks or safety training sessions, the kind that came only from experiencing the consequences of poor judgment in real time. Monica had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with a question that probably had been building since Tyler's revelations about my service record. "Colonel, when you were in command, how did you handle subordinates who made mistakes like Tyler's? I mean, when young soldiers showed poor judgment or treated people disrespectfully?" The question was perceptive, touching on one of the fundamental challenges of military leadership. Young soldiers made mistakes constantly, often serious ones that could affect mission success and unit cohesion. The key was distinguishing between mistakes that reflected character flaws and those that reflected inexperience or incomplete understanding. "Context mattered," I said, settling down on the pool edge next to Monica, my feet dangling in water that felt perfect against skin that had been overheated by afternoon sun and emotional intensity. Mistakes made from inexperience or insufficient information were teaching opportunities. Mistakes made from arrogance, prejudice, or willful disregard for others were disciplinary issues that required more serious intervention. Tyler was listening with the intensity of someone taking mental notes for future reference. Which category would my mistake fall into? I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer would matter to him in ways that extended beyond this afternoon's education. His error had been significant, but it had come from assumptions rather than malice, from overconfidence rather than genuine disrespect for military service. Initially, inexperience. You made assumptions based on limited information, which is a common error among young people in positions of authority.
But the way you've responded to learning about your mistake, the effort you've put into understanding the broader implications, that suggests someone who can learn and grow from feedback." Relief washed over his face like sunrise, and I realized how much my assessment meant to him. This young man who had seemed so confident in his authority a few hours ago was actually deeply concerned about his character, genuinely worried that his mistake reflected fundamental flaws rather than correctable inexperience. Derek had been listening to this exchange with the fascination of someone watching a master class in leadership philosophy, occasionally glancing between Tyler and me like he was witnessing something that would be discussed long after the pool party ended. The grill behind him sat abandoned, expensive fish probably overcooked by now, but no one seemed concerned about dinner when this kind of real-world education was happening in their backyard. "What I learned," Tyler said slowly, "is that respect should be offered first and withdrawn only when it's not deserved, rather than withheld until someone proves they've earned it. I should have treated you with courtesy and dignity from the moment you approached the pool, regardless of what assumptions I was making about your swimming ability." The insight was more sophisticated than I'd expected from someone his age, suggesting that his afternoon research had included some serious reflection on leadership principles and human dignity. It was the kind of learning that couldn't be taught in employee handbooks or safety training sessions, the kind that came only from experiencing the consequences of poor judgment in real time. Monica had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with a question that probably had been building since Tyler's revelations about my service record. "Colonel, when you were in command, how did you handle subordinates who made mistakes like Tyler's? I mean, when young soldiers showed poor judgment or treated people disrespectfully?" The question was perceptive, touching on one of the fundamental challenges of military leadership. Young soldiers made mistakes constantly, often serious ones that could affect mission success and unit cohesion. The key was distinguishing between mistakes that reflected character flaws and those that reflected inexperience or incomplete understanding. "Context mattered," I said, settling down on the pool edge next to Monica, my feet dangling in water that felt perfect against skin that had been overheated by afternoon sun and emotional intensity. Mistakes made from inexperience or insufficient information were teaching opportunities. Mistakes made from arrogance, prejudice, or willful disregard for others were disciplinary issues that required more serious intervention. Tyler was listening with the intensity of someone taking mental notes for future reference. Which category would my mistake fall into? I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer would matter to him in ways that extended beyond this afternoon's education. His error had been significant, but it had come from assumptions rather than malice, from overconfidence rather than genuine disrespect for military service. Initially, inexperience. You made assumptions based on limited information, which is a common error among young people in positions of authority. But the way you've responded to learning about your mistake, the effort you've put into understanding the broader implications, that suggests someone who can learn and grow from feedback. Relief washed over his face like sunrise, and I realized how much my assessment meant to him. This young man who had seemed so confident in his authority a few hours ago was actually deeply concerned about his character, genuinely worried that his mistake reflected fundamental flaws rather than correctable inexperience. Derek had been listening to this exchange with the fascination of someone watching a master class in leadership philosophy, occasionally glancing between Tyler and me like he was witnessing something that would be discussed long after the pool party ended. The grill behind him sat abandoned, expensive fish probably overcooked by now, but no one seemed concerned about dinner when this kind of real-world education was happening in their backyard. "What I learned," Tyler said slowly, "is that respect should be offered first and withdrawn only when it's not deserved, rather than withheld until someone proves they've earned it. I should have treated you with courtesy and dignity from the moment you approached the pool, regardless of what assumptions I was making about your swimming ability." The insight was more sophisticated than I'd expected from someone his age, suggesting that his afternoon research had included some serious reflection on leadership principles and human dignity. It was the kind of learning that couldn't be taught in.
Develop the ability to make decisions with incomplete information, then adapt when new circumstances require different approaches. Most importantly, remember that leadership is about serving others, not being served by them. He was nodding along, but I could see questions forming behind his eyes, probably wondering how those abstract principles translated into practical daily behavior in military settings. The hardest part for most young officers, I continued, is learning that your job is to make everyone else successful, even when that means you don't get recognition for your contributions. The best leaders are often invisible, creating conditions where others can excel rather than seeking spotlight for their own achievements. Derek was listening to this leadership discussion with the fascination of someone whose civilian career had taught him different models of success and advancement. "That's completely opposite to how corporate leadership works," he said. "In pharmaceutical sales, individual achievement and recognition are everything. The most successful people are the ones who make sure everyone knows about their contributions." The contrast was stark and probably explains some of the disconnect between military and civilian approaches to teamwork and recognition. Corporate environments often rewarded individual achievement and self-promotion, while military effectiveness depended on subordinating personal recognition to collective success. "Different environments, different requirements," I said diplomatically. "What works in sales might be counterproductive in combat, and what works in military settings might be ineffective in business contexts." Tyler was absorbing this comparison with visible interest, probably beginning to understand that choosing military service would mean adapting to cultural norms and value systems significantly different from civilian life. It was good that he was thinking about these differences now, before making commitments that would shape the next several years of his life. The afternoon was definitely transitioning toward evening now, the quality of light shifting from bright gold to deeper amber tones that made the pool water look like liquid metal. Most of the other party guests had departed, leaving just our small group and a few families packing up their belongings in the background. The conversation had created its own intimate space, separate from the broader social dynamics of the gathering. "Colonel Wilson," Tyler said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to acknowledge the significance of what he was about to say, "I want to ask you something, and I hope it's not inappropriate." I nodded for him to continue, curious about what question required such serious preamble. "Would you be willing to let me properly welcome you to this pool? I mean, with the respect and recognition you should have received from the beginning?" The request caught me off guard, touching something emotional that I hadn't expected to encounter at a suburban pool party. It was an offer of symbolic correction, a chance to redo our initial interaction with appropriate dignity and respect. Monica was watching this exchange with an expression that suggested she understood the deeper significance of Tyler's offer. Derek had gone very still, probably sensing that something meaningful was about to happen, even if he couldn't articulate exactly what it was. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he intended to formalize this gesture of respect. Tyler straightened his posture, and suddenly his summer job uniform looked less like casual poolside attire and more like the professional clothing of someone taking his responsibilities seriously. "Colonel Wilson, on behalf of the Aquatic Safety Services and everyone present today, I would like to formally welcome you to this facility and express our honor at having someone of your distinguished service use our pool." He paused, glancing around at the small group that had formed around us, then continued with growing confidence. "Your service to our country, your leadership under fire, and your dedication to protecting others have earned you recognition that extends far beyond pool access. Today, you have full use of all facilities with our deepest respect and gratitude." The formality of his words created a strange juxtaposition against the backyard setting, but the sincerity behind them was unmistakable. This young man was offering what amounted to an official apology, a public correction of his earlier mistake, and a gesture of recognition that acknowledged my military service in ways my own family had never attempted. "Furthermore," Tyler continued, his voice gaining strength, "I want everyone here to understand that what happened earlier was my failure, not any deficiency on your part. You handled my disrespect with dignity that I didn't deserve, and I hope my behavior today can serve as an example of how we should treat veterans and all people who deserve our respect." Monica was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, clearly moved by Tyler's formal recognition of something she'd never properly acknowledged herself. Derek stood quietly nearby, his expression suggesting he was witnessing something that would change how he thought about military service and family relationships. "Tyler," I said, standing up and extending my hand toward him, "your apology is accepted, your recognition is appreciated, and your growth today gives me hope for your generation's capacity to learn from mistakes and treat others with dignity." He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who understood that this moment mattered, that it represented more than just the resolution of a poolside misunderstanding. As we stood there, I realized that this afternoon had become about more than swimming laps or family gatherings. It had become about the bridges between military and civilian life, about the assumptions people make about each other, and about the possibility of understanding across generational and cultural divides. "Now," I said, releasing his hand and turning toward the pool, "I believe I was promised some swimming time." The water welcomed me like an old friend, cool and familiar and infinitely forgiving. As I slipped beneath the surface and began the steady rhythm of freestyle strokes, I felt the tension of the afternoon dissolving into the simple meditation of movement and breathing. The pool stretched out before me, 25 yards of clear water that offered the same escape it always had, the same sense of peace that had sustained me through decades of challenges, both military and civilian. Behind me, I could hear Tyler climbing back into his lifeguard chair, but this time his presence felt protective rather than restrictive. Monica and Derek sat at the pool's edge, talking quietly about things I couldn't hear, but could guess involved their newfound understanding of my background and their regret at not making more effort to understand it sooner. The rhythmic motion of swimming created space for reflection on an afternoon that had been far more significant than anyone had anticipated. I'd come here expecting nothing more than family time and some exercise. Instead, I'd encountered assumptions about aging and capability, had my military service unexpectedly revealed and discussed, and had participated in a young man's education about respect, dignity, and the danger of judging people based on superficial observations. Each stroke through the water carried me further from the morning's expectations and deeper into appreciation for the afternoon's unexpected lessons. Tyler's transformation from dismissive authority figure to respectful young man had been remarkable to witness. Monica and Derek's growing understanding of my military background had opened possibilities for deeper family connections I hadn't anticipated. But perhaps most importantly, the entire experience had reminded me that my military service remained a significant part of who I was, even in retirement, even in civilian settings, even when I tried to minimize its significance in social situations. The skills, experiences, and perspectives I'd gained through 26 years of military leadership weren't irrelevant to my civilian life. They were integral to my identity in ways I'd perhaps been reluctant to acknowledge. As I completed my 10th lap and paused at the pool's edge to catch my breath, I realized that Tyler was no longer the only one who had learned something important today. I discovered that hiding my military background, minimizing its significance, and avoiding discussions about my service hadn't protected me from judgment or assumptions. Instead, it had created information gaps that allowed people to fill in their own narratives about my capabilities and experiences. Tyler climbed back down from his chair one final time, approaching with the respectful distance he'd maintained since his transformation earlier in the afternoon. "Colonel Wilson, how was your swim?" "Perfect," I said, and meant it. The water had been exactly what I'd needed, both physically and emotionally. The steady rhythm of swimming had provided the meditation and reflection that always helped me process complex experiences and conflicting emotions. "I hope you'll consider coming back," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth rather than perfunctory customer service.
I mean, not just to this pool, but to other community facilities. I think there are probably a lot of people who could benefit from meeting someone like you, learning from your perspective and experience. The suggestion was thoughtful, touching on questions about my role in the community that I'd been avoiding since retirement. Perhaps there were ways to contribute that didn't require the intensity and responsibility of military command, but still allowed me to share knowledge and experience that might benefit others. Monica and Derek joined us as I climbed out of the pool, both wearing expressions that suggested our family dynamics had shifted permanently during the course of this afternoon. There would be more conversations, deeper discussions about my military service and its ongoing influence on my civilian life. There would be questions I'd need to answer and stories I might choose to share. "Kate," Monica said quietly, "I hope you know that we want to understand more about your military experience. Not just the dramatic stuff that Tyler found online, but what it was really like for you, how it shaped who you are, what it means to you now." The offer represented an opportunity I'd been avoiding for 3 years, the chance to bridge the gap between my military and civilian identities rather than keeping them carefully separated. It would require vulnerability and trust, a willingness to share experiences that weren't always comfortable to discuss. But it might also create the kind of family understanding that I'd been missing without quite realizing it. "I'd like that," I said, and discovered that I meant it completely. As the sun continued its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made even the most ordinary afternoon feel somehow magical, I realized that this day had become about much more than swimming in the deep end. It had become about recognition, respect, understanding, and the possibility of connection across differences that had seemed insurmountable just a few hours earlier. Tyler straightened to attention one final time, and in a voice that carried across the now quiet pool area, he said the words that would end this day perfectly. "Colonel Wilson, the pool is yours." And for the first time in 3 years of civilian life, I truly felt like it was. The drive home took place in the kind of golden evening light that transformed even the most mundane suburban landscape into something approaching beautiful. I navigated the familiar route between Monica's development and my modest apartment, but everything felt different now, like I was seeing the world through slightly adjusted lenses. The strip malls and housing complexes that had seemed anonymous and forgettable on the morning drive now appeared as communities where real people lived complex lives, where assumptions and misunderstandings played out in countless small dramas every day. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Tyler had my number now, and his genuine interest in military service would probably translate into follow-up questions and requests for guidance that extended well beyond pool safety protocols. Monica would want to continue our conversation about family relationships and the military experiences I'd kept carefully compartmentalized for 3 years. Derek would probably have questions about leadership and decision-making that reflected his growing understanding that successful management in pharmaceutical sales might not prepare someone for the complexities of military command. The apartment complex where I lived looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left that morning, but my relationship to it felt subtly different.
For 3 years, this place had been a retreat from the world, a quiet sanctuary where I could exist without explaining my background or justifying my presence in civilian spaces. The anonymity had been comforting, the lack of expectations liberating after decades of carrying responsibility for other people's safety and success. But driving into the parking lot now, I realized that anonymity had come with costs I hadn't fully acknowledged. By keeping my military service private, by avoiding conversations about my background, by presenting myself as simply retired military without elaboration, I'd created a kind of isolation that went beyond physical solitude. I'd been living as a partial version of myself, sharing only the aspects of my identity that seemed safe and uncontroversial in civilian settings. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my unit, my legs carrying the pleasant fatigue that came from actual swimming rather than the careful pool exercises I'd been relegated to at community centers where staff members made similar assumptions about age and capability. The afternoon's laps had been exactly what my body needed, the kind of sustained cardiovascular exercise that cleared both physical tension and mental clutter. Inside my apartment, the familiar quiet felt different, not oppressive or lonely as it sometimes did after social gatherings, but contemplative in a way that invited reflection rather than avoidance. The sparse furnishings and minimal decoration that had once felt appropriately modest now seemed almost austere, like I was living in temporary quarters rather than creating an actual home. I moved through the evening routine I'd established over 3 years of retirement, but each familiar action carried new weight. Preparing a simple dinner gave me time to process the afternoon's conversations. Checking email revealed nothing urgent, which felt like a blessing rather than evidence of social irrelevance. The book I'd been reading sat on the coffee table where I'd left it that morning, a biography of a civilian leader whose challenges seemed almost quaint compared to the complexities Tyler had been researching about my military service. As the sun settled over Moreno Valley, I found myself standing at the window that overlooked the distant lights of Riverside, thinking about the connections that had formed and reformed during a single afternoon. Tyler's transformation from dismissive authority figure to respectful young adult was the kind of personal growth that military training was designed to foster. The ability to recognize mistakes, accept feedback, and adjust behavior based on new information. Monica and Derek's growing awareness of my military background had opened possibilities for family relationships that felt more authentic than the careful politeness we'd maintained for years. But it also created expectations and responsibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to embrace. Being seen as Colonel Wilson rather than just Kate's sister meant fielding questions about experiences I'd spent years trying to process privately, sharing perspectives on leadership and service that I assumed wouldn't be relevant in civilian settings. The sound of my phone ringing broke through the evening's contemplation. Monica's name appeared on the screen, which wasn't entirely surprising given the intensity of our afternoon conversations. But her first words caught me off guard. "Kate, I've been thinking about what happened today, and I owe you an apology that goes way beyond not knowing your rank or your service record." I settled into the chair by the window, prepared for a conversation that would probably extend well into the evening. "What kind of apology?" "For treating your military service like it was something you'd moved past, rather than something that was still part of who you are," she said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "For 3 years, we've been relating to you like your Army career was ancient history, something that didn't affect your civilian life or your family relationships." The observation was more perceptive than I'd expected, touching on dynamics I'd been aware of but hadn't articulated even to myself. My family's well-intentioned attempts to treat me as simply Monica's sister rather than retired military officer had contributed to a kind of compartmentalization that had been perhaps more limiting than protective. "I think I encouraged that," I said honestly. "I wanted to be seen as more than just my military service, and I probably overcorrected by making it seem less important than it actually was." Monica was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of mutual responsibility in our family communication patterns.
Derek and I were talking after you left, and we realized we've been treating military service like it was either traumatic experience that shouldn't be discussed or heroic adventure that was too dramatic for normal conversation. We never figured out how to just acknowledge it as part of your life. The insight was remarkably sophisticated, recognizing that civilian approaches to military service often oscillated between extremes of pity and reverence, without finding comfortable middle ground for ordinary discussion. It was one of the reasons many veterans struggled with civilian relationships, the difficulty of sharing experiences that were simultaneously significant and routine, challenging and rewarding, traumatic and meaningful. It's complicated, I agreed. Military service isn't easily categorized as entirely positive or negative. It shapes you in ways that are difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it, but that doesn't mean it can't be discussed or understood by civilian family members. Our conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics we'd avoided for years and exploring possibilities for deeper connection that acknowledged rather than minimized my military background. By the time we ended the call, both of us had committed to more honest communication about experiences and perspectives that had been kept carefully compartmentalized for 3 years.
The next few days brought unexpected developments that extended the afternoon's impact far beyond pool access and family dynamics. Tyler called on Tuesday with questions about military service that were more thoughtful and specific than I'd anticipated from someone his age. His research had continued, but he'd moved beyond basic information about my service record to deeper questions about leadership philosophy, decision-making under pressure, and the personal costs of military command. Colonel Wilson, I've been reading about the challenges facing military officers who transition to civilian careers, he said during our second conversation. A lot of articles talk about veterans struggling to find purpose and meaning in jobs that feel less significant than military service. Is that something you've experienced? The question demonstrated a level of insight that suggested Tyler was thinking seriously about military service rather than just satisfying curiosity about my background. It also touched on issues I'd been grappling with since retirement, the search for civilian roles that provided the same sense of contribution and challenge that had defined my military career. Purpose is something you create, not something you find, I said, drawing from 3 years of civilian experience that had taught me the limitations of waiting for meaningful work to present itself. Military service provides clear mission focus, but civilian life requires you to define your own objectives and create your own measures of success. Tyler absorbed this perspective with the seriousness of someone who understood that career choices would shape not just his professional life, but his entire identity and sense of self-worth. Our conversation evolved into a broader discussion about service, leadership, and the various ways people could contribute to something larger than their immediate personal interests. By Thursday, I'd received an unexpected phone call from Sarah, the military spouse I'd met briefly at the pool party. Her husband was still deployed to Jordan, but she'd been thinking about our conversation and wanted to know if I'd be interested in speaking to a support group for military families in the Riverside area. We meet twice a month, she explained, mostly spouses dealing with deployment stress, but also veterans adjusting to civilian life and family members trying to understand military culture. What happened at the pool party, the way you handled that situation with such dignity, I think our group could benefit from your perspective. The invitation represented exactly the kind of civilian engagement Tyler had suggested, an opportunity to share military experience in ways that might benefit others without requiring the intensity and responsibility of active duty command. It was also a chance to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, helping people understand each other across cultural divides that often seemed impossible to navigate. I agreed to attend the next meeting, which took place the following Tuesday in a community center conference room that smelled like coffee and hope. 23 people gathered in a circle of folding chairs, sharing stories about deployment challenges, reintegration difficulties, and the ongoing process of building relationships that could survive the unique stresses of military life. My role was initially just to listen,
to offer perspective when asked, and to share experiences that might help others feel less alone in their struggles. But as the evening progressed, I found myself drawn into conversations that felt more meaningful than anything I'd experienced since retirement. These people were dealing with real challenges that my military experience had prepared me to understand, facing decisions and situations where my perspective might actually matter. Maria, whose husband was on his third deployment to Afghanistan, struggled with explaining his absence to their 6-year-old daughter, who was beginning to ask difficult questions about why Daddy's job required him to be away so much. James, a recently retired Navy petty officer, couldn't find civilian work that felt significant enough to justify getting out of bed each morning. Sandra, whose son had been wounded in Iraq, was trying to balance support for his recovery with her own need to process the trauma of nearly losing him. Each story represented challenges that were simultaneously unique and universal, personal struggles that reflected broader issues facing military families and veterans throughout the country. As I listened and occasionally offered insights based on my own experiences, I realized that this was exactly the kind of civilian engagement that could provide the sense of purpose and contribution I'd been searching for since retirement. The meeting lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, much longer than the scheduled 2 hours, because conversations that had been building for months finally found appropriate outlets. People exchanged contact information, made plans for follow-up discussions, and scheduled additional gatherings focused on specific topics like financial planning during deployment and maintaining relationships across time zones. As we cleaned up the conference room and said our goodbyes, Sarah approached with an expression that mixed gratitude with something approaching relief. "Kate, I hope you'll consider making this a regular commitment. What you brought to tonight's discussion, the way you helped people feel heard and understood, we've been trying to create that atmosphere for 2 years." Driving home through quiet suburban streets, I reflected on an evening that had felt more professionally satisfying than any day since my retirement. The problems we'd discussed were real and significant, but they were also solvable through the kind of practical wisdom and emotional support that military experience had taught me to provide. It was meaningful work that used skills I'd developed over decades of service, but in civilian contexts that didn't require the life-and-death intensity of military command. It was exactly the kind of civilian engagement I'd needed but hadn't known how to find. Tyler's interest in military service continued to develop through our regular conversations, but it evolved from simple curiosity about my background to serious consideration of his own career options. He researched different branches and specialties, spoke with recruiters from all services, and visited local military installations to observe training and daily operations. His approach was methodical and mature, focusing on long-term implications rather than immediate excitement about adventure or travel opportunities. During one of our longer conversations, he asked the question that probably had been building since our first encounter at the pool. "Colonel Wilson, based on what you know about me and what I've learned about military service, do you think I'm suited for this kind of career?" The question required careful consideration, balancing honesty about military challenges with respect for his autonomy to make his own life decisions. Tyler had demonstrated capacity for growth, willingness to accept feedback, and genuine interest in serving others. But military service remained demanding in ways that couldn't be fully understood until experienced directly. "I think you have the intellectual capacity and emotional maturity to succeed in military service," I said carefully. "But success depends on factors beyond individual capability. It requires adapting to institutional culture, accepting constraints on personal freedom, and maintaining performance under stress that most civilian careers never approach." Tyler processed this assessment with the seriousness that had characterized all our conversations since his initial transformation at the pool party. "What would you want me to understand about military service that I might not be getting from recruiters or online research?" The question was perceptive, recognizing that official military information focused on opportunities and benefits rather than challenges and limitations that became apparent only through extended service.
It was exactly the kind of question that suggested Tyler was approaching this decision with appropriate seriousness. Military service will change you in ways you can't predict or control, I said, drawing from decades of observing young people transform through training and deployment. Some changes will be positive, developing leadership skills and personal discipline that serve you for life. Some changes will be challenging, affecting how you relate to civilian society and personal relationships. Our conversation continued for another hour, covering topics from deployment schedules to retirement planning, from leadership philosophy to family relationships. By the end, Tyler had a more realistic understanding of military life's complexities, but his interest remained strong and his commitment to further research appeared genuine. 3 months after the pool party that had started everything, I received an invitation that crystallized how much my civilian life had changed since that afternoon. The Riverside Veterans Affairs Office was hosting a recognition ceremony for community members who had made significant contributions to military family support, and they wanted to honor my work with the support group and other veteran services. The ceremony took place in the same community center where I'd attended my first support group meeting, but the conference room had been transformed with patriotic decorations and formal seating arrangements that made it feel more like an official military function than a civilian gathering. Family members, veterans, and community leaders filled every chair, creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration rather than obligatory recognition. Monica and Derek attended, along with Tyler, Sarah and her family, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the veteran support programs that had emerged from a single afternoon's misunderstanding at a suburban pool party.
It was recognition that military service could continue contributing to civilian communities in ways that honored both military experience and civilian needs. It was acknowledgement that veteran knowledge and perspectives had value beyond entertainment or inspiration, that they could address real problems and create genuine solutions. Most importantly, it was evidence that civilian and military communities could understand and support each other across cultural divides that often seemed insurmountable. When called forward to receive the Community Service Award, I stood before an audience that included family members who now understood my military background, young people considering military service, veterans struggling with civilian transition, and military families facing deployment challenges. Each person represented connections that had formed through honest conversation about military experience and civilian needs. The recognition felt different from military awards I'd received throughout my career. Military decorations acknowledged specific actions during defined time periods, usually under extraordinary circumstances that civilian audiences couldn't fully understand. This civilian award recognized sustained contribution to community welfare through ordinary activities that used military experience to address civilian challenges. As I accepted the award and spoke briefly about the importance of supporting military families and veterans, I realized that the afternoon at Monica's pool party had marked a turning point I hadn't recognized at the time. Tyler's initial dismissal and subsequent transformation had forced me to examine my own assumptions about military service in civilian contexts, about family relationships and community connections, about the ways personal identity could evolve beyond active duty commitment. The ceremony concluded with informal conversations that lasted well into the evening, veterans sharing stories with family members, young people asking questions about military service, and community leaders discussing expansion of support programs that had proven successful. It was exactly the kind of civilian-military dialogue that could benefit both communities if sustained through ongoing engagement rather than isolated events. Tyler approached during the reception, his expression carrying news he was clearly eager to share. "Colonel Wilson, I wanted you to be among the first to know. I've decided to enlist in the Army. I've been accepted for officer candidate school, and I report for trainee in 6 weeks." The announcement was simultaneously gratifying and sobering, evidence that our conversations had contributed to a major life decision, but also recognition that this young man was about to embark on challenges that would test him in ways our discussions could only partially prepare him for. "I'm honored that our conversations contributed to your decision," I said, shaking his hand with the firm grip that had become our standard greeting. "But remember that military service is ultimately about the people you'll lead and serve with, not the individual recognition or personal development you might achieve." Tyler nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood he was crossing a threshold that would fundamentally change his life's trajectory. "I've been thinking about what you said about leadership being service to others.
I want to be the kind of officer who makes everyone else successful, even when that means staying in the background. Our conversation was interrupted by Monica, who approached with an expression that mixed pride with something approaching wonder. Over the past 3 months, our family relationship had evolved from polite distance to genuine connection based on more honest communication about experiences and perspectives that had been kept carefully separate for years. "Kate, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice carrying weight that suggested significant news. "Watching your transformation over the past few months, seeing how you found purpose and meaning through veteran support work, it's made Derek and me realize that we want to contribute too." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We've decided to become volunteer coordinators for military family support programs. We can't offer military experience, but we can provide logistical support, fundraising assistance, and civilian perspective that might help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities." The offer represented exactly the kind of civilian engagement that veteran support programs needed to succeed long-term. Military families required assistance that extended beyond what veterans could provide alone, practical support with civilian challenges like housing, employment, education, and community integration that required civilian knowledge and connections. "That would be incredibly valuable," I said, recognizing that Monica and Derek's offer reflected genuine commitment rather than temporary enthusiasm inspired by a single event. Military families need civilian allies who understand their challenges and can help them navigate systems that weren't designed with military lifestyle demands in mind. As the evening continued and conversations gradually wound down, I found myself reflecting on 3 months of civilian engagement that had grown from a single afternoon's misunderstanding into meaningful community contribution. The pool party incident had forced me to confront assumptions about military service in civilian contexts, about family relationships and community connections, about the ongoing relevance of military experience in retirement. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that civilian and military communities could understand and support each other when presented with opportunities for genuine dialogue rather than superficial interaction. Tyler's transformation from dismissive authority figure to respectful military candidate represented the kind of growth that was possible when people approached each other with openness to learning, rather than certainty about limitations. Driving home through familiar streets that now felt like actual community rather than anonymous suburban landscape, I realized that the afternoon at Monica's pool had marked the beginning of civilian life rather than just another family gathering. For 3 years, I'd been existing in retirement rather than living in it, maintaining distance from community engagement that might require sharing military experience or accepting civilian recognition. The veteran support work, family conversations, and community involvement that had emerged from Tyler's initial mistake had created exactly the kind of civilian purpose I'd been searching for without knowing how to find it. It was meaningful work that used military experience constructively, honored both military service and civilian needs, and created connections that enriched both communities. As I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I noticed that the space no longer felt like temporary quarters or isolated retreat. It had become home base for civilian engagement that felt as significant as any military assignment, different in scope and intensity, but equally meaningful in terms of contribution and purpose. The phone rang as I was preparing for bed, Tyler's name appearing on the screen one final time before his departure for officer candidate school. His voice carried excitement mixed with appropriate nervousness about the challenges ahead. "Colonel Wilson, I wanted you to be among the first to know. I've decided to enlist in the Army. I've been accepted for officer candidate school, and I report for training in 6 weeks." The announcement was simultaneously gratifying and sobering, evidence that our conversations had contributed to a major life decision, but also recognition that this young man was about to embark on challenges that would test him in ways our discussions could only partially prepare him for. "I'm honored that our conversations contributed to your decision," I said, shaking his hand with the firm grip that had become our standard greeting. "But remember that military service is ultimately about the people you'll lead and serve with, not the individual recognition or personal development you might achieve." Tyler nodded with the seriousness of someone who understood he was crossing a threshold that would fundamentally change his life's trajectory. "I've been thinking about what you said about leadership being service to others. I want to be the kind of officer who makes everyone else successful, even when that means staying in the background." Our conversation was interrupted by Monica, who approached with an expression that mixed pride with something approaching wonder.
Over the past 3 months, our family relationship had evolved from polite distance to genuine connection based on more honest communication about experiences and perspectives that had been kept carefully separate for years. "Kate, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice carrying weight that suggested significant news. "Watching your transformation over the past few months, seeing how you found purpose and meaning through veteran support work, it's made Derek and me realize that we want to contribute too." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We've decided to become volunteer coordinators for military family support programs. We can't offer military experience, but we can provide logistical support, fundraising assistance, and civilian perspective that might help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities." The offer represented exactly the kind of civilian engagement that veteran support programs needed to succeed long-term. Military families required assistance that extended beyond what veterans could provide alone. Practical support with civilian challenges like housing, employment, education, and community integration that required civilian knowledge and connections. "That would be incredibly valuable," I said, recognizing that Monica and Derek's offer reflected genuine commitment rather than temporary enthusiasm inspired by a single event. Military families need civilian allies who understand their challenges and can help them navigate systems that weren't designed with military lifestyle demands in mind. As the evening continued and conversations gradually wound down, I found myself reflecting on 3 months of civilian engagement that had grown from a single afternoon's misunderstanding into meaningful community contribution. The pool party incident had forced me to confront assumptions about military service in civilian contexts, about family relationships and community connections, about the ongoing relevance of military experience in retirement. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that civilian and military communities could understand and support each other when presented with opportunities for genuine dialogue rather than superficial interaction. Tyler's transformation from dismissive authority figure to respectful military candidate represented the kind of growth that was possible when people approached each other with openness to learning, rather than certainty about limitations. Driving home through familiar streets that now felt like actual community rather than anonymous suburban landscape, I realized that the afternoon at Monica's pool had marked the beginning of civilian life, rather than just another family gathering. For 3 years, I'd been existing in retirement rather than living in it, maintaining distance from community engagement that might require sharing military experience or accepting civilian recognition. The veteran support work, family conversations, and community involvement that had emerged from Tyler's initial mistake had created exactly the kind of civilian purpose I'd been searching for without knowing how to find it. It was meaningful work that used military experience constructively, honored both military service and civilian needs, and created connections that enriched both communities. As I pulled into my